Okay, quick music disclaimer here. I do not own the rights to this music, which belongs to the rightful owner, who is the intoxicating mind of Dr. Frankenstein. So he made my intro and my outro, and I hope you guys enjoy. Check them out on Spotify and YouTube, and no copyright infringement is intended. Have a good day.
A clear choice of good versus evil, of right versus wrong.
Twisted Tales.
Warning: quick disclaimer for today's episode. We'll be discussing things about pedophilia, child murder, cannibalism, and sexual crimes against children. If this is too much for you to handle, take care, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Due to some violent content, parental discretion is advised.
Right, welcome back to Twisted Tales, folks. So, I'm just gonna carry on with our Albert fucking Fish fuckery. So, let's dive right into this. Now, the way that Albert was able to get all these kids to fucking follow him and everything, right? It's mostly because he pretended to be a nice dude. Kind of like an old grandfather type, to the kids and whatnot. So here, he would build, trust with them, right? And they come with him a lot easier under his guidance. And then, once he got them alone, he just turned on them. He would strangle them, torture them, sometimes for days, or what have you, right? Now, over the course of his years here, Fish had this little boy here that he knew, and he raped a couple times here. The boy was with his friend one day, and he had seen the boys playing what they call box ball, or I guess what's now known as foursquare. So the game, it's played on a square court divided by two perpendicular lines into four identical boxes, creating four squares labeled 1 to 4 or A to D. Now, this child here was about 10 years old, and he was molesting him for quite some time. This kid's name was Cyril Quinn, and he had his buddy with him, like I said. So Fish had his meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. Now Quinn and his friend were playing on a sidewalk when Fish rolled up and asked them, have you eaten any lunch or anything, right? Come on and hang out. And they said that they didn't have any lunch, so he invited them up into his apartment for some sandwiches. Now the boys were wrestling on Fish's bed here as he got things ready, and they had accidentally dislodged the mattress. Underneath the mattress, they found the knife, the meat cleaver, and the handsaw. So they were like, what the fuck? This isn't right. And they got really frightened about this, and they ran out of the apartment. So they had ruined the plans that Fish had set out. So obviously, he was pissed, but he continued on with his life. So around this time, Fish was still on the loose, being a dick, and doing all of his weirdness. Example here, he was actually getting really big into the classified newspaper ads. He would reply to some of these ads just for shits and giggles, for something to do. There was a couple here that I found. This one here surrounded the Budd family. Now, this was an ad written by one Edward Budd, and this was on May 25th, 1928, in the Sunday edition of the New York World. So, it read as follows. Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. So Albert had seen this, and he decided to reply. But he didn't use his real name, obviously. He used a different name. He called himself Frank Howard. And after a little bit of writing and whatnot, back and forth, he pretty much showed up at this kid's address here sometime later. Now, he offered the 18-year-old like a wicked job offer, and he wanted him to come work on his farm. And he mentioned that he had 6 kids and that his wife had recently left him. So we got to talking, and he was even going to invite Edward's, like, his friends along and everything, right? Give him a job as well, right? So they could both come over. And once they left, Fish would kill them. So he told the family that he would visit them very soon, and he kept in touch by writing letters there after, he talked to them and everything in person. He did give a requested day that he would show up, but unfortunately, he didn't show up on that requested day. So this kind of gave the Budd family a feeling of maybe it was too good to be true. But Fish replied back in a letter that he got caught up, he was very busy, and he would swing by in a few days or so. So with the notes and everything that he was sending, right, he went up, he showed up, and he kind of looked for Eddie Budd, he said. So the woman had invited him in, and once inside, he noticed that Eddie Budd was this like big strapping 18-year-old, right? And he didn't fucking know this because of the letters and everything, right? And this was the first time that he showed up. So yeah, Eddie came over and he actually noticed that this guy was like a brick shithouse of a man, right? And his friend Willie Cormer, who he offered the job to as well through the letters, was the exact same. Willie ended up living on 9th Avenue there. So even if he wanted to, he couldn't even attempt to fucking rape or do any debauchery that he wanted to on these 2 men. He was just like a fucking feeble 50-year-old by now, right? With a bunch of pins and needles up his ass. So the mother and father of the family, they were Delilah and Albert Budd. Yeah, there's a fucking ton of people named Albert in this pod. So they ended up talking to him here. Now, the reason that Fish replied to the newspaper ads was because he wanted to get more victims by using a fake name, right? And he would probably never be caught due to this back in those days, right? Edward's personal ad wasn't just merely like a call for employment or anything, right? Some say it was actually a plea for help or to escape his country and whatnot, right? Because he wanted to contribute to the well-being of his family, bring in more money and shit like that. So, like, they wouldn't be so poor, and perhaps maybe he can move the family to the United States for a better life. Back in those days, there was a ton of weirdos that kind of looked through personal ads and everything, right? Looking to do crimes and harm the ones that wrote them, like kill them or whatnot. Albert Fish wasn't the only one doing this. And there were countless young men, women, looking for a way out just to leave their homes for financial gain and to make better lives for themselves and their families. And there was no way to tell what kind of weird fucks would reply to those messages, and especially Albert Fish, who kind of disguised himself as a kindly farmer, right? So, a little on the father here, Albert Budd. Now, some say he had the resemblance of like this silent fucking film comedian here, Harold Clayton Lloyd. This guy was an American actor, comedian, actually a stunt performer here who starred in many silent comedy films. That guy was born April 20th, 1893 in Bertrand, Nebraska. He died March 8th, 1971 at the age of 77 up in Beverly Hills, California. And he was an actor through the years of 1913 to 1963. So back to Albert Budd. Now this dude, and throughout his life, he actually tried to get jobs left, right, and center. He felt that it was his eyesight that kept him from getting the good jobs. Because he had like a marble right eye, kind of painted glass and whatnot. Now his left eye was full of infectious cataracts. So it kind of deterred him from getting a little bit of work. Now by 1928, him and Delilah had 2 boys and 2 girls. And the couple lived like this whole meager fucking life kind of, right? They didn't have much money and whatnot, but they ended up getting a place at 406 West 15th Street up in Manhattan's Chelsea district. The eldest son, Edward, he was really eager to get a steady job. I mean, he worked like a day here, a day there, right? With some trucking firm here, but there was nothing set in stone. Now, the folks were delighted at his attempt to go forth and finally get a steady job at the newspaper. Once in the Bud home, Delilah offered up some biscuits and some coffee to him. So Albert just had his coffee black. She poured 2 cups, sat down, and she started to assess this old prick. So, looking at him, he was in his 50s. He looked a lot older than he was. He's full of gray hairs and everything, kind of uneven, trimmed mustache. Had a 3-piece navy blue suit on, blue shirt, black brogues, black socks. He looked a little bit uneasy, and she noticed that some of his teeth were rotten and discolored. He had transient blue eyes, and he had very deep, black patches below them. Kind of looked like he was just really drained or really tired. He mentioned that several years ago, he was an interior decorator up in Washington, D.C. His eyes had started to fail him a little bit, so he decided to take up farming instead. And then he moved to Farmingdale, Long Island. Kind of ironic, I guess. Farmingdale. So here, he said he purchased a 21-acre farm and began growing vegetables for the market. And business was actually booming for him. And already he hired a couple farm hands, but he needed a few more just to keep up. So that's why he was here, to hire those 2 kids. So that's when he seen her son's job ad, and about a half hour later, the father came through the door. So they were introduced, and Fish told the father all the details of the job, and he was actually very delighted. Now he was like, oh, my son's gonna fucking make something of himself, right? Pretty proud. Fish said in return for his hard work, he would pay the kid $15 a week, plus room and board. So the kid had heard this, and just being really excited, he started jumping around the room. He would now be making the same sum as his father. And this was a lot of money, even the mother said that. But she told Fish, my husband is going to have to give his full consent on the matter. So they did work out this whole agreement here and all the stipulations and stuff like that. They were like, well, we'll talk more here. How about next Saturday? So this would give the family some time to mull it over. Fish then thanked them, touched the brim of his hat, and bid them adieu. Now originally, he was to return about a week later. Edward had finally had all the permission from his family by this time, and Fish ended up being slightly late for this meeting, yet again. But he sent another telegram that said, I've been over in Jersey on business. Call in the morning, Frank Howard. And he arrived back Sunday, June 3rd, after about 11 a.m. This was after the family had returned from church, and they went to the church at the Holy Cross Church. Now, to make up for being late, Fish actually brought some presents to the family and the kids. He handed the mother a box of strawberries and a pail full of pot cheese. So, both, he said, they were brought fresh from his farm, and she placed them in this porcelain bowl that the family owned. But when she did this, she noticed that something about the cheese wasn't right. It wasn't fresh, like he said. So she took a whiff and noticed that it was completely fucking rotten. So she's not really going to serve that up. So as they sat down here, they talked about the telegram that came, and it was actually addressed to William, not Edward. So it sat right upon the mantel. So Fish, he got up, he walked to the mantel, and he kind of read the error aloud. He's like, well, I'll take this with me here. I'll report the error to the post office. I'll need this as evidence, he said, and he put the telegram into his pocket. So the family carried on. They were engaging in conversation with the man. The conversation was slightly interrupted here when a girl came in. This was young Grace Budd. She came inside from playing with the kids. Now, this was the sister of the boy. They nicknamed her Gracie or whatever. That's what her brother called her. And when Fish had seen young Gracie come in, he just switched up his MO pretty quick. He actually set his sights on her. I mean, she was smaller, weaker, more fragile than the two boys that he had originally planned to take, and he would have no problem killing her and then satisfying his weird fucking bloodlust feeling. Everyone who knew Gracie mentioned that she was the nicest, sweetest kid ever in life. A very well-behaved child all around. She was a thin, pale complexioned child. She weighed about 60 pounds soaking wet, and she had large blue eyes and dark brown hair. On that day, she had on her white confirmation dress from church that she actually wore earlier in the morning, and she also had on white canvas pumps with leather soles and heels, white silk stockings, and a necklace of white imitation pearl beads, so like fake pearls. Over the dress that she wore, she had this gray faded coat with a little bit of fur on the collar, and had a hat tied around her neck just to keep it on her head. Now, when she seen Albert, she ran right into his arms, and he replied with, "What a beautiful child." He told her that she would grow up to be a real heartbreaker. And right then and there, that's when things changed. He told Albert and Willie that he wouldn't be able to set out until later on that night. But now the wheels in his head, they started turning, and he wanted to switch things up. He had a new plan, and he didn't waste any fucking time on this. So the reason he said that he wanted to do things a little later was because he had a married sister who was having a birthday party that afternoon. And, it was for one of her kids and whatnot. And he was going to go to that in the afternoon. And none of that shit was true. He actually dug into his pockets. He gave Edward $2 to take, a couple of his buddies to the movies or whatnot here. And Fish would return later, pick him up, after he had the visit with his sister. So the boys got excited. They took off for a movie. And, he put a little bit more focus on Grace. So he was talking to her. He said, "Are you a good counter?" he said. So she nodded yes. He pulled out a thick wad of money and like a 50-cent piece. So he pulled out bill by bill, and she counted how much it was. She counted $92, and he awarded her with the 50-cent piece. And he's like, "You earned this, you're a good counter." So what she did, she went to the store, she bought a gingerbread cookie and some lemon drops. When she got back, Fish stood up, and he ended up giving her a hug and said, "Well, it's time for me to go." So he kind of thought for a sec, and he said to her, "How would you like to come with me to a birthday party? It's being held at 137 in Columbus Avenue." Then he asked the parents, I'll have Grace home by supper, right? And to this, Delilah kind of hesitated a little bit. But the father was delighted. "The poor kid," he said. "She's been cooped up in the cellar too long." And then he's like, "Well, where's the party at again?" So Fish told him yet again. And the two left the place to go to the birthday party. Grace ended up kissing both her parents goodbye. Fish tilted his hat once again, and they went hand in hand down 9th Avenue. So Grace was walking down. She turned around, flashed the family a smile. She gave a wave back to her folks. And, unfortunately, they never saw her again. Eddie and Willie got back from the movies here. Now, this was about 4 p.m. So they gathered up their work clothes for the new job commute, and then they waited for Mr. Howard's return. Then time went by. It was now 5 p.m. Supper was ready to be served. And here, Mr. Bud started to get a little bit uneasy, right? Because now, the chimes of the bell was now 6 p.m. So he picked up the phone. He called the 20th Street Police Station just to make an inquiry, right? Were there any accidents around, or, involving a young girl or anything of that matter? Nobody reported anything about a girl. He told her what they were wearing, or what he was wearing, but they didn't hear anything. And finally, hours and hours went by, and it was now midnight. So they waited around. They stayed up, waiting for like a telegram or something, because he usually sent those, right? And now it was fucking 7 a.m. Monday morning. Still no word. So the father had breakfast and he headed off to work. He didn't want to, but I mean, you gotta go make money, right? So he assured his wife that the rich farmer would be back. Probably just something happened. He'll have an excuse for being late with the child. Like maybe they spent the night at the party or something like that. Now, a few hours later, a call was made to police yet again. A description of Fish was given. A description of the child was given. Edward actually made the call this time here. So he told police at the 10th precinct about like his ad and how Albert Fish like replied to it, or Mr. Howard, whatever he called himself, about his visit, how they gave permission for them to like go to the party and everything. And this was up on 137th Street in Columbus, he said, and he gave this address to the dispatch. Upon hearing the address given by the son, the police just kind of got silent on the other end there. He's like, "Where'd you say that party was again?" Then the address was repeated. And he's like, "You're certain that's the address that Mr. Howard took her for the party?" Edward's like, "Yeah, man, why?" "Well," said the policeman, "there's no such address. Columbus Avenue only reaches as far as 109th Street. So obviously, right then and there, the two knew something was wrong. Here's how it all shook down. After taking the Bud girl from her home, he walked to the corner. He got his bundle that he brought with him here, and he got Grace along. So the two had taken this whole L train to Sedgwick Avenue and a Putnam Division train to Worthington. And this is where like he formerly lived prior, right? So he knew the area. Albert Fish brought this whole like canvas piece with him here. It was like 6 feet long, 4 feet wide. But he got a little confused here. He left the bundle at a newsstand here at 14th Street, 9th Avenue. And the little girl reminded him that he didn't have it, right? Because he was carrying it before and now he didn't have it and they were already on the train. So, what the thing is with this here, like, the poor girl reminded Fish that he forgot what he was carrying. And what this was his instruments of hell that he had later murdered her with. It's fucking terrible, right? So they went back to retrieve it. And they took an elevated train part of the way, and they got to the Worthington Woods on the Putnam Division of the New York Central Railroad. Fish got 2 transfers, 1 round trip for himself, and 1 one-way for Grace. Albert Fish took Grace, that was dressed up in her Sunday best, to a house upstate. Now, this was the same one that he had intended to use as a torture chamber for her older brother. Now, the house is about 75 feet from the old Dublin Road. So when they got there, he told her to remain outside, and Fish then went inside by himself, 1 flight up into the house while Grace was picking wildflowers out into the yard. Albert went upstairs, he unpacked his instruments of hell, and he stripped all of his clothes off. He took off his top coat first and put his clothes on a nearby chair because obviously he didn't want to get them covered in blood because he knew what was going to fucking happen. Now he hid in an upstairs bedroom, and when Fish was ready, he went to the window and called on Grace to come upstairs because he had this big surprise for her. And then he hid in a closet until she came upstairs and entered the room. And there was the surprise. Albert Fish, completely nude. Now she saw him naked. She began to cry, had tried to run down the stairs to escape. He chased her. He ended up grabbing her arm. She screamed. She's like, "I'm gonna tell my mama." Then he tightly pulled her back, stripped her naked, to which she did fight really hard against him. She kicked him. She actually bit him a couple times there. She scratched him. But I mean, this barely did anything. I mean, Fish loved the pain, right? And she fucking put up a good fight, right? Even for being a young girl. So Fish, in his own words here later on, said that she gave me the surprise of my life, he said, as she was a frail-looking child. He then got on top of her, and he choked her. He ended up propping one of his knees on her chest, shoving it into her chest to get the last little bit of breath out of her. And then, while he was doing this, he had 2 involuntary ejaculations. He said later on, to get her out of her misery, I did this and then cut her throat. And then he propped up her head on an old paint can and he fucking decapitated her, catching most of the blood in this old ass rusty paint can that he found out front. And then he started to dissect her, just like a butcher would. Extremely precise. He split her into sections, and he was saving some of the meat for himself. So he was taking some parts and wrapping them in newspaper, and he ended up cutting her head totally off. Her arms that he cut off, he ended up putting them in the corner of the room. Then the other corner, over by a door, he put some other parts here, and then he opened the door a bit so he could put them behind, and they would be half hidden. The head was then wrapped up in paper, and he carried it to an area of a rear room here, and then went outside with it. He brought her head to this like old ass toilet, like outhouse or what have you there, and he kind of left it around that area. And then he went back inside for the remaining parts. He then cut some more parts off. He took her forearm and some other small pieces here, wrapped them up in a bandana handkerchief that he carried around with him, and then placed it on the table. So, in the midst of all this here, he had a little bit of fun by sticking some cotton in his ass, and this was actually doused with lighter fluid. He lit them up with either like kitchen matches and whatnot, and then he pleasured himself until he reached orgasm. And afterwards, he took some of the pieces that we wrapped up with him. Then he left for a train station and didn't give a thought or a look back as to what he had just done to Grace Budd. And he headed back home. That was it. He was done. Now, the next morning, he got up, he went to the market, he purchased 3 pounds of potatoes, 2 pounds of onions, some carrots, and some parsley. And then he stopped off at the dairy for a quart of milk, and he headed back. He got together a stew pot here. He removed the piece of her forearm from the bandana, chopped it into 4 parts with his cleaver, dropped it all in the pot. He added a quart of vegetables, a little bit of water, and some bouillon cubes. He fired up the fire underneath the pot. He watched it boil, cooked everything, and then he ate this little girl. So he practiced cannibalism for a few days. He ended up heading back up to Wisteria Cottage and going back home. So he went back and forth, back and forth. He was just grabbing pieces of Grace's body to cook and eat. And when he finished off the remaining vegetables and stuff, he began to cook her body with bacon. He ate the flesh during the day, and then he thought about it during the nights. He was actually relishing like this whole crime of fucking brutalness, right? Reliving that moment again in his head. How he was choking her and, making her breathe her last little breath and everything. And during the night, he would masturbate to these thoughts until he orgasmed, and sometimes this would be multiple times per night. Now, he ate what he could off her body for a period of 9 days, so he lived off this fucking body of this young girl for 9 goddamn days. He then returned to Wisteria Cottage and carried the rest of her torso to a thicket. This is about 150 to 200 feet from the house. He took the remaining parts and he tossed them behind like this old stone fucking wall or whatever, right? It's all crumbly and shit. Deteriorated and whatnot. And like I said, this was just like another little bit of fun for him, right? He got to relive this shit. But I mean, it was misery to the family, right? They fucking lost a loved one, right? and he had abducted her from her family, and they never fucking seen her again. The family obviously still wondering what happened to their daughter and the man known as Mr. Howard. It puzzled the family for like months, and then unfortunately, years to come. And this case became very well known. It was in like all the papers here, and then soon it was global wide. Now there were people that came forward with sightings of the old man here and little girl at the time of her abduction. But unfortunately, police didn't get any closer with the investigation. Even though there were folk that still remembered her kidnapping and everything, right? Like it wasn't erased from people's memories or anything, but it just, they couldn't figure out anything. Police did searches all over the place when she had first disappeared. Many people were questioned, many people were brought in for questioning, but nobody knew anything. Police had even pumped out like a few wells that were in the area just to see if her body was tossed in there, right? But to no avail. And unfortunately, kids went missing a lot back in that time, right? She eventually became just another missing person at this point. Even with a few promising leads and whatnot, police just kept hitting dead ends. Now, a dozen detectives searched homes and cellars and all that. They searched the Budd residence, anywhere around there. This was anywhere from West 20th Street up to the Chelsea area neighborhood and whatnot. Now, there were rumors that went around saying that the man, known as Howard, had an automobile with Pennsylvania plates. He was bow-legged, things like that. On a Tuesday, this was June 5th, a Brooklyn woman reported that the man, resembling Mr. Howard, because he had his pictures in the paper and whatnot, had tried to take her kid around 6 p.m. And when she noticed, the man had simply said, "Oh, sorry," and then he hopped in a car with another male and female. And Mrs. Budd started receiving like postcards galore from like random folk, right? Some were, worried and everything, but others were just dicks. They were telling her like where they could find her daughter's body and what had happened to her and shit like that. Saying that Grace could be found at like cellars and whatnot, and she was located in this place and that. Now, some had mentioned that she was in a body of water and she drowned, but police actually checked everywhere around all the watery areas and everything, and they never found anything. And there were also some rumors that ran around that Mr. Howard was part of this like whole kidnapping gang, and they were going around stealing kids for God knows what reason. Even kids around the Budd residence here told police that they had seen Grace get into a car with an older man. But nothing ever came of this. And eventually, the story just faded out of the newspapers here. It went cold, and it went to the Missing Persons Bureau. I mean, they always checked up on leads that came in and shit like this as the time passed, but nothing set in stone. Over time, a janitor named Charles Edward Pope was identified by Mrs. Budd. He spent 109 days in jail. And when it came down to the trial here on December 22nd of 1930, she was actually unsure about this guy's identity here, and the judge actually ordered an acquittal. And years passed. This was 1931 now, so 3 years later. A dude named Alfred Korchel was arrested in Florida and extradited back to New York, where a grand jury indicted him on Mrs. Budd's like whole identity thing here, right? Because she identified him as the man who took her child. But unfortunately, she didn't know 100% about this, right? She's like, maybe it could be him. He's older and whatnot, but the judge ended up shutting shit down and he was set free, right? Now soon, a bunch of letters were sent into the family. Once again, like they came every once in a while. And the family just never opened them. They just set them aside here. they didn't want to read them. Then life went on for them, shitty as this whole situation was. Now the man who did the deed was still on the loose, still living his life, still being a prick. All while turning other people's lives upside down just to fucking fulfill his sick, twisted vanities of murder and cannibalism. And Albert Fish is fucking gross. But he carried on with his life here. Now, despite already being married, Fish got married to a woman named Estella Wilcox. And this was on February 6, 1930, up in Waterloo, New York. And they divorced after only 1 week. She was the daughter of Albert Baker and Elizabeth Ann Baker. So Estella was born May 2nd, 1867, up in Illinois, USA. She had 6 brothers and 1 sister. Fortunately, she passed on April 30th, 1937, at the age of 69. And she passed up in Waterloo, Black Hawk County, Iowa. She's buried at Elmwood Cemetery, Waterloo. And life just goes on for Fish. So roughly 2 years after Grace Budd's murder, Albert was just taking odd jobs as much as he could just to get by. He ended up riding freight trains and shit. He would hitchhike across the country. So now he was like working, and he began living off like random women that he would meet up with or like write to and whatnot. Now he picked up his old hobby of messaging women through the newspaper ads yet again. So he would pick the ones that claimed to be rich, so he would go and date them. Now soon enough, he found out they weren't rich, and he would dip out rather quickly. So he would write to them to like, see and ask questions about their sexual desires if they had matched his own. But he was careful with this. But he was just feeling it out and all that shit. And he met a lot of women doing this, but he never hooked into a relationship here. Like, none ever really clicked and just didn't happen. He once contacted a Bronx widow one time for I guess she was selling some furniture. So she had an 11-year-old daughter. He talked her up by like letters galore, and they eventually moved in with him. Now, at one point during the whole relationship and shit, he began to fondle the 11-year-old and actually exposed himself to her at one point. And it got a little weirder because then, over time, all 3 would sleep in the same bed. And I tried to look up some more on this here, but not much is known about how that relationship went or ended or whatnot. It's just a couple articles that I found online. Now, another time, he wrote to a woman here. This was through a Marriage Bureau publication. This was called the Friendship Magazine. So they got to talking, and it came up that the woman had close to like $18,000 in the bank. So obviously Fish was all like drooling and hot and horny to fucking talk to her, right? Fish replied like boasting that he had like money in various bank accounts all over the world. Just total horseshit because he's a broke fucking prick. But he somehow persuaded her to give him like $2,000 from her savings for like some business venture type deal or some shit. So she loaned it to him. And some time went by. She asked for it back. And he was never heard from again, right? So he took off and he stole her money. And then through a Lonely Heart magazine, he dated and then married one Myrta Nicholas. This is a poor woman who lived with 4 of her 7 children. This is on the outskirts of Bartlett, Ohio. So while he was with her, his behavior became very erratic, very strange. He began eating like raw eggs for breakfast. Every evening after supper, he would go into a room. Then a few minutes later, he would come out on his hands and knees with only underwear on, carrying this like old paint stirring stick and a hairbrush. Now the hairbrush had sharp bristles here, and he wanted the kids to play a game. So what they would do, they would climb on his back, facing his rear end, and he would let them guess how many fingers that he held up, kind of like the same thing that he did with his kids growing up. You know, if they guessed wrong, they would hit him on the ass with the brush or the paint stick. Even if they guessed the answer right, you know, the answer was always wrong. And then they would have to hit him one time very hard. After about an hour of this here, he would just switch it up to a game that he called Sack of Potatoes Over. Now, what this is where he let a kid onto his shoulders and then slid down his bare back, clawing him with their fingernails on the way down. So they would play this game until his back was just completely red, shredded up, and just ripped as shit and bleeding. Now, the wife had eventually kiboshed this game as one of her kids slipped off of his shoulders and fell on his head. I mean, you'd think he would stop that before that happened, you know what I mean? It's fucked up. He also played a game, you know, with his wife. So once the kids were asleep, you know, that's where the magic happens. Fish commanded her to bind him and whip his naked body with leather straps until he cried, and then he would just start laughing from the pain because he's such a fucking maniac. And then he would get her. Here's the fucking bonus round, I guess. He would get her to stick needles into his fingernails full length, like the whole fucking way down. Sometimes, you know, he'd do some crazy shit. He'd fuck off, and she would have to look for him by lantern at nighttime because, you know, he would just leave into the cold woods, wouldn't tell anybody. And she did go out and look for him, but it was just too cold for her, so she would turn back. But what she would see is his footprints heading into the dark parts of the forest, so he'd just fuck off out there and be weird. Yeah, whatever, he was just a weird guy, I guess, that Albert Fish. And by 1930, Fish resurfaced in New York. So he began renting a woman here who had an ad for like maid services and shit like that. So he told her that he was this like big artist and whatnot. And he had like 40 fucking models, all girls and boys and whatnot. He ended up writing her weird shit like if they misbehaved, then he'd beat them with a cat o' nine tails that he hung in the pantry. What he wanted from her was to be in charge of them. Certain days a week, you know, give them a beating. She ended up making a complaint to the post office, so the post office set this whole trap for him. He was arrested, actually, indicted, and convicted of sending letters of indecent character through the U.S. mail. So they looked through his shit. They found some newspaper clippings here that he kept. A lot were about violence. There was some stuff about like homosexual weddings and stuff, sex change operations. And during the trial, the judge declared the letters just vile, filthy, and of obscene nature. But unfortunately, his sentence was postponed until he could be put under observation in the Bellevue psychopathic ward. So they were going to determine whether this guy was sane or insane. So this place was just jam-packed, right? Like just grossly overpacked with patients, right? They only had 12 doctors running this whole ward back in the 1930s. So they let out about 50 patients a day. They would assess them like, whatever, this guy's cool. See you later. Now, Fish was looked at. He had an assessment done and many other medical examinations. One nurse described him as quiet, affable, and well-nourished. He had a general physician look at him, and they revealed evidence of early signs of senile changes. He had inflamed kidneys, hearing in both ears was diminishing, and he was suffering from lead colic. This is a painter's occupational disease that affected his nervous system. Albert told them, "I feel all right. I am weak. I've never been sick in my life. I never had a doctor. I am not insane. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with me." Like the fuck. And one of Fish's daughters she went over all these interviews and shit with him there. Even though he kind of left them high and dry there on God's command back in 1928. when she got there, like, Fish didn't know the reason for his arrest or anything. She felt that he wanted to be alone, not bothered by anybody. And he was asked about, like, the whole writing the obscene letters and shit. So he said about a year ago, I just started to do it, right? I just started to write weird ass letters. And like, I did this before and I just picked it back up. So Fish replied that he got into the habit of reading a bunch of letters that were found in like an old sanitarium. This is up in Harlem. So he had no desire for anything before that, writing letters and stuff, but reading the letters that he found, just sort of became a habit, you know? Then they asked about his wife, about her running off with another man. Fish admitted that he took it very hard and that it hurt him very much. Now, during a few weeks here by this point, he spent most of his time talking to patients here, sleeping properly, and eating. And then, all of a sudden, nurses noticed a little bit of a change in him. He became a loner. He started talking to himself while wandering around. And he was counting the days on his fingers. Shit like that. He also began, like, praying in the bathtub when he was allowed for his bath. And he felt that God had forsaken them. Ugh, shit happens. But later on, the results were all back in full here, from all his testings, medical examinations, all that. The results had showed that he suffered from sexual psychopathy. He developed this early in his life, and although he was abnormal and sufficient mental capacity, he did know, like, the nature and the quality of his acts. He could differentiate the difference between right and wrong, and it was put down that he was just very disturbed, but very sane. And the courts had sentenced him to 6 months probation due to their findings. And on January 16th of 1931, he was set free. And by now, there was a man named William King. Now, this guy was doing his job here. He was a cop. He was looking for clues on the Grace Budd case. This guy was put on this case a couple of years back. Back in the fall of 1930, he actually traveled some 40,000 miles on this case, looking for Grace Budd and the man that they called Frank Howard. But his investigations failed at every lead. Now, it was found out that Delilah Budd had used this like fortune teller and stuff like that over time. She was going to get information on her missing daughter. It kind of pissed King off because he didn't like that she was speaking to outsiders on the case, right? Because a lot of misinformation here and talking to them could kind of blow the whole case here, right? Like it could hurt the case and whatnot. He wanted to work on this shit personally. And this guy went so hard in this case there, he followed up everything that he heard. There were even officers that would actually make fun of this guy here, talk behind his back and shit. Now, some officers that actually gave him information at one point actually just avoided him because they thought he was fucking chasing a dead case and whatnot. And like I said, this guy just didn't fucking stop. In my opinion, he did a good job. And we'll go into May of 1932, meow. So this dude was now up for early retirement here from the New York City Police. He joined the New York City Police in 1927 here, and he worked on like more than 3,000 missing persons cases. But he didn't want to retire though. It was fuck all for an ex-cop. I mean, what do you do here? Grab a job as a security officer or something? Nah, wasn't this guy's style. He announced to everybody that he would retire when he solved the case of Grace Budd. But by now, there was a whole bunch of other shit coming up. The big case now was the Lindbergh baby case here. I mean, there was like fucking 19,000 cops assigned to that case. And around the time of this case here, Mr. King actually had a nervous and physical collapse. Dun dun dun. So he was put on like physical limitations at the local hospital here for a 3-month period before he recovered fully. And he desperately wanted to get back to work, right? So this dude's workload was just kind of lightened a little bit here, and they tossed him on this whole like receptionist type gig for a bit. So he worked the job for a couple more years, and no new leads rolled in. It was now 6 years of him working this case. He tried his hardest to figure shit out, and even though most of his peers thought that he was just wasting his fucking time, he kept going. Like, this guy didn't think he was wasting his time at all, right? There was a family out there that needed closure, and obviously they'd been through a shit show since the day that Mr. Howard, also known as Albert Fish, walked through their door. Now, the Budd family ended up giving this guy, like, all the mail that they received, because they didn't want to read it, right? This is all the stuff over the years here, and they actually had a couple telegrams from Mr. Howard. And in the summer of 1934, he spent a bit more time on the case. He actually attended an applied psychology course at Columbia University just to help him get like a more detailed view of the kidnapper's profile. You know, how they worked, how they clicked, and all that. And shortly after attending this class, he received a call from Mrs. Budd. But he took this with a grain of salt, since the last 2 times that she identified men, they went to jail for a little bit, and that had nothing to do with the case, right? But he did acknowledge her anyways, right? And he went down to the family's new apartment. So he arrived at West 24th Street. He saw a middle-aged man dressed in gray. So he thought nothing of this here, and he went up to speak with Mrs. Budd. Now, he came down sometime later, and the man was still around. He was just like crossing the street, circling around, walking around buildings and shit. So the officer, Will King, he just caught up with him here. He brought him in for questioning, right? The dude's name was William Mitchell. So he made mention that he saw Grace and an old man riding on the Bronx subway some time ago. King now questioned this guy, found out more, and it was found out that Mitchell received medical attention at Bellevue, that he was an inmate at the city home on Welfare Island. Now, the man followed the case since the beginning, right? And to satisfy King's curiosity, he asked the man to write down some stuff. As he did, he kind of matched the handwriting to Frank Howard's original telegram to the Budds, and the handwriting didn't match. So they talked. Mitchell wanted to concoct this whole plan to find Grace Budd, right? He wanted to get the authority from the officer to, like, search the neighborhood here. I think she might be over here type thing, right? So the weird guy wanted to search 4 blocks east and west of Jerome Avenue, from 147th Street down to 170th Street. And if he found her, like, he wanted this whole ass reward, right? So Buddy was just putting on this fucking front. Mr. King said, "You know what? I'll be in touch, man. I'll talk to my supervisor. We'll figure this shit out." Didn't even fucking call him back, right? Now, he wanted to forget this dude. But months later, he started receiving letters from Welfare Island about the Grace Budd case, right? King actually ignored them. But on June 13th, 1934, King got word that Mitchell contacted the Budds yet again. This time, he mailed them a photograph from the June 4th edition of the Daily Mirror. So the photograph had shown 2 sailors from a U.S. fleet with 2 teenage girls posing on Riverside Drive. He actually drew an arrow to a girl. The girl had a hat, and in her arm was a sailor with a mustache and whatnot. So the arrow said, "Isn't this Grace?" So obviously this was checked into, right? Did have some resemblance. The girl was just older now. Now Delilah and Edward had examined the photo with like a magnifying glass. It did strike a little resemblance to Grace, but King kind of, took it. He looked at it, and he's like, "Yeah, maybe it is, right?" But I mean, even if it was her, like, why didn't she contact the family and everything, right? This is kind of fishy. So King wanted to have the photo made in several thousand copies and then be posted in the Daily Mirror. So then King went to visit this whole like U.S. Navy vessel here. So he went aboard, and he wanted to have a request that the Navy broadcast a plea for help among the listed men. To which this dude, David Foote Sellers, had agreed to, right? So this guy here was the old commander-in-chief. So he had given his full cooperation, and he would try to get infos from the sailors about this girl. So it was made up in the papers with the question, have you seen this girl? Now, sometime later, the girl in the photo was not Grace, but a Miss Florence Swinney. She came down to police. She named her and her friend and the two sailors. So it wasn't Grace Budd, but, what do you do? Another shit letdown. So now things were back to square fucking one. And as we wind down here, folks, I'll just give you a little bit more detail on this. Now, he went back to the Budd residence, said that unfortunately it's not Grace, and then Albert Budd handed King a bunch of letters. Some of them that they got since the pictures were posted in the papers. He received some 20 letters a day since it was posted. He took all the letters with them, and then he began reading them one by one when he returned back to his office. Now, as this was going on, Albert Jr. was actually rekindling with his father here, Albert Sr., and this was the summer of 1934. So they ended up getting some steady work that Fish had lined up. They were going to split the pay evenly. Fish was a little bit older now, and he couldn't do the work himself. Couldn't finish the whole job by himself, shit like that, right? Now, the job that he got was a superintendent of an apartment building at 1883, 1885, and 1887 Amsterdam Avenue. This is on the Upper West Side in Manhattan. But this didn't last long. The two would begin to argue. Albert Jr. ended up getting pissed off about the way that his father was carrying the workload, right? Which wasn't much. So Albert Jr. kind of found it more tolerable to work by himself, and his dad just fucking sat on the couch. And then soon, he would just watch his father's weird behavior, right? Sometimes the son would come into the apartment here, his dad would just be beet red in color, breathing heavy, kind of like he was running and whatnot. But, he was just sitting there, right? And Albert Jr. noticed that every time there's a full moon, he witnessed his dad consume completely raw, uncooked steaks. The son actually found his paddle. This was made with nails one time. And it had recently been used. It was actually dripping with blood. And one night, the son woke up to find his dad standing over him in a whole trance-like state. When he asked him what he was doing, Fish had left without saying a word. Another time, he heard his dad scream out in his sleep the words, Bud. Bud. Obviously, Grace Budd, but his kid didn't know that. And obviously, he didn't understand what it meant at the time, right? But, he just ignored everything from this, right? He's like, my dad's fucking weird, whatever. And there was one day that Fish had went to the apartment owner's place here. He demanded a bag of lime. He was going to kill this cat, actually. The owner gave him a 90-pound bag of lime. Yeah, no questions asked. Here you go, right? So Albert Jr. and Sr. spread it all over the floor. And Albert Sr. actually was beginning to build this trap for this cat here. This was concocted of chicken wire, crates, heavy boards. And if the cat went in here, rubbed up against a certain amount of lumber or whatever, this would cause other pieces to fucking fall down and would crush the cat to death, right? So, all of a sudden, Albert Fish had jumped back, totally shocked. And he said, there it is. You see that cat? Albert Jr. looked in the direction. There was nothing around. The whole, floor of lime was completely untouched. No paw prints, no anything. He said, Pop, there's no cat. And then his father ended up fiddling with the trap some more, and his son left him. And he went upstairs. And not long after this incident here, the pair were actually fired from the superintendent here of the apartment building This was nothing to do with Albert Jr. or whatever, right? But, he did good work. He was reliable. But this was because of Albert Sr.'s dirty deeds. Now, all this shit here got back to the owner of the building here. One of the tenants explained that Albert Sr. had reached out from a dark hallway, threw his coat over a little girl that was like playing in the hallway and whatnot, and he attempted to take her. Now, she screamed, which brought out the mother, and she saw this shit, lost her cool. I mean, rightfully so, that's her fucking kid. Fish is like, oh, I'm just playing it off, right? I'm just giving her my coat, she was cold. Now, he was caught in the act, and she told the owner about what happened at the incident, and both were let go, which actually pissed off Albert Jr. a lot. And they were given 2 weeks to vacate the premises. And sometime after this, the two just split. Fish went his way. He did his own thing, and then Albert Jr. fucking went and did his own thing, right? But what Fish would do now is he just picked up that whole letter writing and shit, and he started to write a woman named Mrs. Shaw. Now, she had placed this ad in the Sunday paper or whatever, right? She was offering to rent rooms to elderly persons or invalids, as it goes, I guess, back then. And what I'll do here is I will end it, and I will talk more on this Mrs. Shaw and the letters and all the fuckery here, because that goes into a lot more detail than I want to cover right now. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Take her easy. I love you guys. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Tales.
Twisted Tales.